My name is Nermin Soyalp, and I just recently graduated from Transformative Studies Ph.D. program. And my dissertation title is A Transdisciplinary Perspective on the Historical Traumas among Armenian, Kurdish, and Turkish people of Anatolia, Transgenerational Trauma, Turkishness, and the Epistemologies of Ignorance. The title is long, and so the dissertation was. I ended up writing 500 pages, and you pretty much can graduate with 150. But there was just like so much to say. And when I formed my inquiry question, it was about what's preventing us from healing, what's preventing us from peace. So I was looking at obstacles, so I didn't realize, I mean, I had a sense that it was a very big question, but I didn't realize how big it was once I get into that. And once I started, I had to finish it. So if there are PhD students here, it's very important how you form your question. And be careful about what you're getting yourself into. So it took many years for me to complete my research, and it has been a rewarding, incredibly rewarding journey. It was a theoretical research, transdisciplinarity, from a transformative perspective, which means I had a question in hand, and I followed that thread to answer the question. So I had to explore four main paradigms. One was the history, because we are talking about historical trauma, so I had to really deeply understand what happened. So I did a lot of historical review. I looked at psychology, how trauma transmits from generation to generation, and that's brought me to Armand and his work, and we collaborated, bringing Turks, Kurds, and Armenians together for workshops. And even though it was theoretical, the workshops we did really intimately influenced every page in my dissertation. The stories shared in these workshops. And I also did a lot of field work. I was in Turkey, traveling 2 to 3 months at times, speaking to villagers and meeting scholars, and going to conferences, participating in protests. So I was very personally, deeply involved. And so let's go to the next. And next 10 minutes or so, I'll be talking about I'll give you a very brief history of Anatolia, because I wouldn't be able to fit all that into 5-10 minutes. And then I'll share my main finding, which was the presence of epistemologies of ignorance. That was what was actually preventing us from healing. And then the systemic aspect of transgenerational trauma, which many of our presenters touched base on. So this is the map of today's Turkey. And just to give you a context of what I mean by Anatolia, and that's the Asian part of Turkey, that's Anadolu, that's also in Turkish, that is also referred as Anatolia as the land. To answer my inquiry question, as I mentioned earlier, I wanted to understand the history, what happened in the past, and I had a framework for that. I followed sociologist Piotr Stomka's cultural trauma theory. According to his theory, he says, in order to study historical trauma, we need to understand what happened before the event, because nothing happens out of the blue, not in a vacuum. Like things led up to what happened. So understand what happened before, and then what happened during the event as full as we can understand it. Who was involved, what was the context, the adaptations, maladaptations, and what kind of traumatic influences people had, and so what kind of meanings people made, how it changed the identity, collective identity, myths and norms and stories, and trying to understand all that, and also what happened afterwards. Because usually if we don't collectively heal from the collective trauma, there is another traumatic sequence that is introduced. So it's so when with that perspective, I made a list of like last 200 years, all the collective traumatic events that happened in Turkey, in Anatolia. Of course, it started with the Ottoman Empire, the last 100 years of Ottoman Empire, what led up to the fall of the empire, and the list was so long. And not all of them are here. I brought the major ones, and I'm not going to be able to get into the details of exactly what happened. And I have a very detailed history chapter in my dissertation. If any of you wants to know, you can get in touch with me, and then I can send you my dissertation. What I want to mention here is I made a list of all these collective traumatic events, and then I went to each one individually, and I started to see a thread, how they're all connected, how one caused another. And it really, sometimes I use an analogy of a carpet, and we actually have a couple carpets here, and if like Anatolian carpets, if you see them, there's all these threads, and it really started to weave. And there was a story that was much bigger, and I realized how Turkey has been caught in a perpetuation of violence, one after another. And if you look at the dates, there are like every decade, one thing, one major trauma happened. And so I'm not gonna, unfortunately, go into details. So what I want to highlight here is the aspect of epistemologies of ignorance. So when I started looking at the history and trying to make sense of what happened in the past, and which I actually didn't know much about. When I entered in this research, I really didn't know as much as I did today. I had some ideas. And so as I'm reading these historical literatures, I'm realizing in one area there's ample of research, and some others there's nothing. And I'm trying to do a theoretical research, so it was very important for me to find some resource so I can, make a reference. And I didn't know what to do with that. There's like a big void in the literature, and then in some areas there was a big disagreements about what happened. For example, Armenian genocide. There are a lot of Turkish scholars. There's a big denial in Turkey, so there's a whole different literature about what happened back then. And then there are Armenian scholars, especially in diaspora, they write about Armenian genocide from a completely different perspective. And I didn't know what to make sense of it or how to make sense of it. So as I engaged in the literature, especially by meeting people and in the workshops, meeting with people who actually hold these stories and listen from them, what happened to their people, I started the ignorance started to become as a finding. I realized actually those voids or disagreements was as my data point, was saying something very important about what is going on in Turkey. And so epistemologies of ignorance from, so I found feminist philosophers, Sullivan and Tuana's work in epistemologies of ignorance, which became very central to my work. I wrote 3 chapters just focusing on this. So it means the promotion and maintenance of ignorance for the purposes of domination and exploitation. So after the Ottoman Empire collapsed and the formation of the Turkish Republic, the war, decade of long war, and the perpetuation of violence and suffering was so devastating. And also, many of us are familiar, winners write history. History books are written by, the winner states. So they, and there was one agenda. They wanted to create unite people under one national identity, which was ethnically Turkish and secular Muslims. So and Ottoman Empire was a multi-ethnic, multi-religious society. So Ottoman identity was more inclusive if you compare it to the Turkish identity. It was a homogenization process which is not new. I mean, a lot of other countries, like a nationalism as an ideology that began in the after French Revolution and 1800s, where a lot of countries were declaring their independence. So the idea was, in order to bind people together, we need to create one homogeneous identity. So in order to do that, in Turkey's case, what happened in the past was erased in order to start something new. And consequently, in this process, the new identity was based on the denial of certain historical realities, such as Armenian genocide and Kurds' ethnopolitical place in the society. So Kurds and Turks actually fought side by side during the independence war under the Muslimness identity. And then when the republic was formed, because of the secular agenda, Kurds didn't find place that they thought they would. And since then, the rebellions happened and violent suppression of those rebellions, and still the conflict continues today. And you might hear many of those from the news. So one collective trauma followed another, and not because Turkey hasn't been able to come in terms with their history and learn and heal from that. There's an accumulation of trauma in the experience. So when there's an accumulation, it starts to become really complex, really complicated and tangled. So generation by generation, we really have a much more tangled situation now. And so epistemological ignorance, generation by generation, continue to perpetuate dehumanization, lack of empathy, and further fuel collective traumatization and conflicts. So in Turkey's case, it's like a lid, preventing people to look at actually what really happened. And which is really important. It's like the first step of healing is really actually finding out what happened and being able to face it. So we are kind of stuck in stage 1 of peace and reconciliation process. So I wanted to end with the systemic aspect of transgenerational trauma. And because the impact, and a lot of the presenters also commented on these, the impacts are not only the individual. So there is a micro level, the individual factors. Christine talked about the biology of that. And there is the mental health, the physical body. And then the family and communal, what kind of norms, ethics, taboos, myths and stories that this traumatic event that might have caused. And then there are societal, structural ones, culture, institutions, education. So in Turkey's case, the laws and regulations that was created, that was implemented, it's a top-down institutional. So we need to be able to look at these things if we are going to heal from transgenerational trauma, because it's not only up to me as an individual. It's an institutional. It's part of family dynamics, and it's on all of these different forms of society. And therefore, healing is a collective journey. One of the, I think I was like midway through my dissertation process, I took all the burden thinking like I'm supposed to fix all this. I think some of us can go through that process. And then it's really important to realize it's not only up to me, and we are carrying the medicine and the burden together. And that's why it's very important to create healing communities where we can actually talk about these things. So the last word is the change needs to come from all levels of society in order to transform historical trauma's complex nature. And that's all I have to say tonight. Thank you.